Have you ever pondered that grand cosmic question, the one that burns deep within all of us? Am I able to see that thing? And if so, am I able to attack that thing? If you've wondered this, you might be a tabletop player, enjoying the struggles of debating whether things have cover or other potential special rules based on how the map works, because the table layout is very much a third actor in the grand scheme of the battle. It plays just as much of a pivotal role by taking units that may otherwise be unbridled murder machines and tossing obstacles in their path to greatly limit their heinous potential. And Kill Team is no different in this regard. Terrain doesn't simply just exist as a means to obfuscate vision. No sir, it comes with a collection of rules and terms to further push its nuance into the realm of pedantry. Many an argument, hell, many a friendship can be shattered when trying to determine whether one little plastic unit can see another similarly small plastic unit. The brutality. Personally, I have tried to clear this up a little bit in my overarching Kill Team 2024 rules overview video. I thought I did all right, but maybe just maybe not all right enough. This still seems to be a problem that resonates with so many. Truly life's greatest struggle. Not world hunger, not peace in our time, no. I just want to understand if I can roll the dice and why. So I want to take a slightly deeper dive into the rules of Kill Team 24 with a bit more nuanced of a look into what it takes to navigate the rules in a way where people can more quickly understand what options they have. Buckle in, we're in for a nerdy ride. Real quick though, before we set off on this journey wrought with hazards, if you're new to the channel and enjoy tabletop gaming, the strategy, the hobby, the camaraderie, or even just the oddity of it all, don't forget to hit that subscribe button. It truly helps a lot. And I hear those thumbs do something, although I have not verified this myself. And in the description below, there is a link to a Discord community. If you seek fellowship among the geekdom, don't hesitate to join. We'll be happy to have you. So let's kick this video into gear and see if we can't solve this cosmic conundrum. Am I able to see the thing? Firstly, I do believe we should establish that this is explicitly for Kill Team 2024. I am also putting this together in the early stages of that iteration. Games Workshop games are consistently in flux due to the information age. They will consistently adjust and correct their games through the use of the Warhammer community page. Data slates will drop, FAQs will be posted. These things can change what is said here in small or large ways. I will personally try and keep up with those releases to provide all of you a decent understanding of the shifts in the cosmic web, but certainly check for yourself to see if anything here gets adjusted, be it distances or whether effects occur or not based on positioning and height of either the target or the aggressor. One thing that doesn't seem to change much across the board for Games Workshop games: visibility. Simply put, this is the process of drawing a single line from the head of a model to any part on an enemy model, excluding the base. Now, this can get truly aggressive with some people, and variances in model height can also greatly change what can be seen, at least when compared to the terrain being used to protect your operatives. For instance, this glitchling is fairly short. I know some people will base their units utilizing things like corkboard or just big stones. This can of course drastically change the height of a model. Please take this into account when determining sight. But in this state behind this wall, what can the glitchling see? It does have a ranged attack and is one of the few models that cannot be targeted while in cover, regardless of order. But behind this simple barricade, you may find that the head is a little too short to truly see anything. Pedantic, I know. Rules as written, models like this become extremely difficult to utilize, and even larger models like this Kasserkin, when placed behind a mobile barricade, loses a large area of vision, preventing it from firing back at its enemies. I realize this is a simple game played by people looking to have a good time, Among your friends and potentially even among competitive scenes, there is probably a lax concept that can be applied here to simply consider vision as coming from any point on a model to any point on another model. But when trying to learn the core rules writing, as it is right now, this is the baseline for vision. It can mean that model silhouette and stance are very important at times when playing in this more pedantic system, which does make modeling for advantage a little bit odd, which is why I want to quickly introduce to players new and old a core idea of tabletop gaming in general: playing by intent. To many, these games are more of a conversation than a simple game of chess. An easy statement such as, "I'm placing a unit here in hopes to see this area over here," and receiving positive verification of this goal from your opponent can prevent misunderstandings down the road. It could allow for a simple, "but that character can't see over the wall, so how can you have vision?" statement that could allow you as the player to determine a different course of action that could more clearly end in the result desired, or to at least provide your opponent the understanding of the overarching intent of the action in the first place, so that they can make a more informed strategic decision going forward with their actions. The mastery of this conversation is important across the board for many. It can be key in maintaining a game state in an extremely positive way, where both players, regardless of wins or losses, feel like the outcome was fantastic and unquestionable. I should probably work on a separate video for this. This still means that a line must be drawn from most likely the head area of a model to any part of an enemy model or target model, as visibility does tie in with some ally-to-ally benefits. So this Wayseeker, when trying to see an ally, can easily be said to have in full vision that Corsair across from it. But do you see the beak of the Corsair hunter peeking around the corner? That is simply a bird, but with how the rules are written, that hunter is also in vision of the Wayseeker. And this logic can be applied throughout. On one hand, this should push your strategy to include the facing and standing of models on the field to prevent exterior components from peeking around corners. But on the other, playing by intent, you could simply state this model is to be here and not visible around a corner by any component, which is useful in a game where there is potential for models to slightly shift as the game progresses. I have jiggled many a terrain piece in my time, and if suddenly a commando's gun barrel that wasn't facing around a corner finds itself peeking out, at the very least because of the statement of intent for the positioning, all involved should remember that the intent of the placement would prevent that gun barrel from being seen. Of course, consider this within reason. Peeking a Gellerpox Hulk around a corner and then saying, "I didn't want him around that corner," is what we call in the business a little power gamey. And remember that sometimes your own view on the battlefield may at first have you thinking that something is visible because you easily see it in the general vicinity of your operative. But a unit on top of a tall vantage would find it pretty hard to see an enemy target immediately below its location. Kind of hard to lean models off of the edge of terrain. At least within Kill Team, the question of visibility is probably one of the easier elements to wrap your head around. Regardless of where your character stands or how high they are on vantage, these lines are all drawn the same way and for the most part can easily be determined by trying to look with your own eyes past the unit towards what you wish to target. And this is where the playing by intent conversation yet again comes in. It might be faster in a lot of situations to ask your opponent if a model can be seen from their side. Easier to do that rather than walk around the table every 2 minutes. Keep in mind when reading abilities and actions in the game of Kill Team that they will explicitly use the term visible as well as terms like valid target to determine the requirements of the action. The Void Dancer's Shadow Seer Fog of Dreams ability only requires visibility to a ready enemy operative, whereas Mirror of Minds requires that its target be valid, and some abilities like the Mind Witch's Malefic Vortex requires visibility to a part of the kill zone, expanding the idea of visible targets to the very battleground itself. So, in review, The core of visibility runs the line of practically putting yourself in the shoes of the operative and determining in that moment what they could potentially see. And using playing by intent, you, the player, could avoid arguments and gotcha mechanics by integrating conversation into the core of this. Now, hopefully you have a practical understanding of visibility. Does this mean we can roll dice? That depends. There are some abilities in gear, like the stun grenade, that only require visibility before rolling to check for effects and potentially even damage. But for actions that require a valid target to be present in its sequence, like the universal shoot action, there is a slight checklist that must occur. Honestly, this feels simple. To be a valid target, the operative must appease the gods of visibility that we just went over. Could my operative arguably see a part of the enemy operative with its eyes, excluding its base, of course? Once that obstacle is overcome, we look at the order the model is in. Engaged models don't have a standard way of preventing themselves from being valid targets if they are visible. The glitchling we talked about before has its own special rule preventing itself from being considered a valid target regardless of order as long as it is in cover, which we'll go over in a second. So unless the target has a rule like this, which I highly suggest asking your opponent about before the game starts, all you would need to do is determine the outcome of the action, which will vary depending on which action you're taking. Where things get a little different is if the target is in conceal and is also considered in cover. I feel one of the biggest disconnects people tend to have is how cover works. Probably one of the biggest points of contention in Kill Team for many who are new to our little corner of the universe. A kill zone, in its rawest form, is a parking lot. Nothing but the light breeze between your team and your enemy. The conceptual third player in this game would be the very terrain being used, all of which comes with its own keywords and parameters. Light, heavy, insignificant. These are terms worth knowing. Many preset maps such as Beta Decima, Vulcus, and the Gallowdark already have the terminology attached to every possible piece of terrain that will be used in those situations. It tends to make things easier when trying to determine the type of battle you will be going into. If you are planning to do something a little more open and freeform, I highly suggest declaring what every component of your kill zone is. Converse with your adversary, come to conclusions on what should be heavy versus light, what exists to provide no benefit and can simply be insignificant. If you were at an event, this should already be laid out, most likely by those hosting it. So anything from the strongholds of Vulcus down to a small control panel and an open map could have specific terms that will cause the benefit of cover to occur, providing concealed operatives a slight advantage in their stealthiness. And all this directly interacts with an element called control range. Every model has a base, and that base has an invisible 1-inch bubble around it that interacts with other allies and enemy bases at times. It can also interact with terrain. If a component of terrain is within that bubble, that specific part of the terrain is considered to provide cover against attacks that draw targeting lines over top of it. To be clear, this does not mean that the target is universally in cover against attacks from any angle, just the ones that interact with this element of the terrain. I know that was just a lot of nerd lingo. Let's break it down a little more. On a two-dimensional plane, this looks like trying to draw a triangle. Starting with a single point on your own unit's base, you draw two lines to the farthest out edges of your target's base. If there is nothing of terrain that exists in an area chosen to be considered the targeting line triangle, then there is nothing to worry about further in regards to cover. But if there is a piece of terrain, heavy or light, and that piece is within the 1-inch bubble that the targeting line triangle passes directly over top of, then cover is provided. On a three-dimensional plane, this gets a little bit more advanced and will probably require a little bit more conversation at times as this triangle becomes more of a cone. We'll dive into that a little more in another section. So this Vet Guard trooper in a conceal order with this small piece of light terrain within an inch of it that stands between the unit attempting to target it and itself cannot be considered a valid target at a baseline. Kill Team tends to have a bunch of rules that circumvent things like this. If the unit attempting to target it is doing so with a weapon profile that carries with it one of the seek options, this could override the conceal and cover function. To further reiterate that knowing what the terrain is can be highly important, if the attack has the seek light rule, the Vet Guard is targetable, regardless of order in this moment. If it has the basic seek rule, it would also be targetable. If it was only seek heavy, however, because the terrain is light, it would not work. Also note that cover in of itself can be fully prevented if the attacking operative is within 2 inches of its target. There is also a way to override the restriction of cover for actions attempted by operatives on vantage, a minimum of 2 inches higher than their intended targets when it comes explicitly to light cover. Remember that visibility is still a thing here, so 2 operatives on opposite sides of a flat wall will not be able to attack each other in most situations. This may be best to show you in a sort of checklist. Seeking to perform an action on a valid target will require one giant checkbox that simply states visibility. I feel that this is very straightforward, as we've already gone over it, and it's honestly quite simple for the most part. The second giant checkbox simply states that the unit would not be considered to have cover while maintaining a concealed order for the action. Checking both of these establishes a target as valid. At this point, a Hearthkin Kinlink could system jam the target without issue. Any abilities that simply call for a valid target can be enacted upon. For most of them, cover and even the concept of obscuring won't matter for the end results. Shooting, however, provides a third step to the total equation of what all of this culminates to. Dice rolling for damage. So we've passed the visibility checkmark, we've passed the valid target checkmark, and on a basic level, this covers whether or not an operative can see another, at least on a flat surface. But most of the questions that plague Reddit involve how the shooting can occur in these situations. Just a sprawl of pictures that don't provide the whole story, asking, can Model A shoot Model B? With just these 2 points of contention, the answer would be yes, but this feels like not the whole story, as there are mitigating factors to how that combat is rolled, and for the most part, this is explicitly for shooting. Using an ability outside of this won't really be mitigated by it. Remember that triangle drawn from a single point on the attacking model to the target? Well, depending on what exists inside of that triangle between the attacker and the target, different rules are applied to the overall action. You can view these as any kind of tacked on buff or debuff in most role-playing games. Before rolling for the attack, it might be best to iron out with your opponent what of these would be established as active and what would be negated based on attacker rules. Step 1 would be to try to determine whether cover or obscuring or both exists. Cover is fairly simple, and we already kind of went over it, but I want to give a little bit more of a view on how to consider it. Being within 1 inch of a large wall does not provide cover from the entirety of the wall. That 1 inch bubble is the explicit area of terrain that would provide the benefit of cover. Being very close to terrain in this way will provide a larger area of protection. If you're the kind of person that tries to finagle that 1 inch distance between you and the terrain to prevent something like an enemy getting within range to fight, you'll also find that the wall and the protection is greatly limited when it comes to targeting lines. Both heavy and light terrain can provide this state of protection, so when either is within that 1 inch bubble and the drawn triangle passes over it, it will provide whatever benefits it can. Without anything extra, this will simply be a single retained defense dice as a normal save. Quick reminder that the dice retained in this way doesn't actually have a number on it. Retaining a normal save for an operative with a 6+ save doesn't guarantee it's a crit. You have to think of the dice more as a representation of just a normal save without any real number on it. There are of course rules that circumvent this, like saturate, which would prevent the retaining of a dice due to cover. This does not prevent cover from existing as the state the operative is in, so it won't override that cover when trying to determine if the target is valid. And if that cover would provide anything else beneficial to the operative, like an enhancement or whatever save they make being slightly higher, that could still trigger. Only the retention is prevented from saturate. This all occurs within that 1-inch bubble. Now, to push this further, terrain outside of that 1-inch bubble can still interact with the targeting lines and provide benefits to the target, if that terrain is considered heavy. This can provide the benefit of obscuring. Not quite as awesome as it used to be, no sir, but many of us abused that power, so it had to be readjusted. There are, of course, ways to prevent obscuring from being provided to the target operative, but in a raw state without any exterior rules, obscuring prevents dice from being retained as criticals and forces the opponent to sacrifice a single normal hit. Again, dice rolled as criticals aren't discarded, they are merely downgraded to normal, thus preventing triggered critical effects as well as allowing the target to only need normal saves to prevent them. There is an example shown within the rulebook that tries to emphasize that these rules of cover and obscuring could allow a single piece of heavy terrain to provide both benefits to a target based on where the enemy firing is shooting from. It looks a little like this. Assuming the cargo crate is considered heavy and that Space Marine is firing on that Legionary, the best triangle that can be drawn between operatives would look like this. If we overlay the 1-inch bubble on the Legionary, you'll notice the targeting lines do pass over a part of the terrain within that distance, providing cover, but also part of that heavy terrain outside of the 1-inch, providing obscuring. So in this instance, not only can the Space Marine not retain criticals and have to sacrifice a single normal hit from the total attacks it makes, it would also allow the Legionary to retain a normal save if it wants. An extreme level of damage mitigation. Quick reminder to check with your opponent whether or not they have operatives or weapons that come with things like cannot be obscured or saturate. It will help you in attempting to pull this kind of positioning off. You know, whether or not it's useful. We're not necessarily done with this example yet. To be clear, when it comes to the potential of obscuring heavy terrain, if the attacking operative is within a certain distance of that 1-inch bubble that the opponent has, it should be near impossible to have the enemy target gain the benefit of obscuring. This is where we dive further into the pedantics. Heavy terrain that could provide obscuring is ignored if it is within 1 inch of the attacking target. So when we apply that to this overall example, if the attacking operative and its invisible 1-inch control range bubble overlaps onto the opponent's 1-inch bubble, most heavy terrain would not provide obscuring, as there is now this gap where obscuring would not be allowed. And this 2-inch range works in tandem with an element of cover as well. File this away in your mental archives. When two operatives are 2 inches or less from each other, if one is targeting the other with a ranged ability that requires a valid target, cover is overridden simply by the distance between the operatives. And to further clarify maybe a confusing concept, heavy terrain within an operative's 1-inch bubble is ignored for obscuring when they perform actions that would involve the potential of an obscuring benefit. This way, an operative using a heavy wall for cover doesn't confer obscuring to all their targets. For the most part, when it comes to distance finagling and cover to try and allow or deny certain enemy interactions, playing by intent is yet again key in all of this. Pre-measuring your operative movement as well as your opponent's possible movement and choosing locations with all that in mind is a great way to converse about the expected results of these actions, ensuring your operative's safety as they attempt to achieve their goals. I know, this is all a lot, and in this instance we're only using 2 dimensions here. Stick around for the advanced section as I introduce you to the horrors of vantage points. Cover and obscuring in this fashion leads to very detailed conversations about whether or not small pieces of terrain are considered intervening. Games Workshop has already made some adjustments to the general terrain rules involving not allowing small pieces from the barricades to be considered light anymore, and instead they will be considered insignificant. Most of the heavy terrain that is used has small outcroppings of stone and rubble, maybe even some support beams. It could be considered good sportsmanship before maneuvering into these areas to declare the reason. I'm moving here because this stone should break targeting lines from these angles. I'm pocketing here because even if you're around this building, you'll have to be further out in order to fully see my operative. That way, at least everyone can be in agreement before moving forward. This can greatly smooth out strategic options and plays as the game progresses, and even if on a flat surface, both players feel fairly confident in their actions being taken as fairly understandable, there are some instances where maybe more in-depth conversation will be needed. So we went over everything with visibility and targeting lines as based on the two-dimensional surface of the kill zone floor. Simple enough. But now we enter the realm of height differences, the heretical place from which only darkness is born. One of the more contentious concepts in Kill Team, and personally why I kind of love the Gallo Dark, as it irons out 90% of these issues, mostly by completely getting rid of the concept of Vantage overall. Either way, when Vantage is in use for an operative, either as an attacker or a target, in most instances, the targeting lines shift from the flat two-dimensional triangle that is already kind of hard to visualize for some into a three-dimensional cone. Visibility stays much the same, as it is checking the basics of can the model physically see the other model. But because the targeting lines shift more to a cone, the entire target's base is important to whether or not you can see them, as well as whether or not terrain intervening could provide heavy, obscuring benefits. Being on the second floor of a building might feel like a domineering position, but a lot of the maps put forward by Games Workshop serve odd situations for those units to try to find balance for those below. Now, there are certainly several long-ranged operatives who overlook obscuring altogether, and for them, this might not matter as much. But dropping a heavy bolter on top of a building may not provide all positives when attacking enemies on the kill zone floor. Much of what we have already talked about still reigns true. Once this conceptual cone is drawn from one element of a base to all parts of the targets, the terrain that exists within what is now a 1-inch sphere around the target space, as well as heavy terrain outside of that 1 inch, will interact with this attack. Take this for example. A simple Space Marine with a simple bolt gun sits on a simple Vantage. It really wishes to decimate that cultist over there, as any good Space Marine would. But when it draws this flashlight-like cone, a piece of that heavy terrain breaks into some of that area. When you apply a 1-inch sphere around that cultist, that terrain is not part of that area, and it is certainly farther than 1 inch from the Space Marine. This means that the cultist will gain the benefit of obscuring for this attack. Again, this cone is only important for base to base. You are not looking to paint a vision to every inch of the cultist itself. Looping back to intent, if I were the Chaos Cults player and I was debating moving that cultist into that position, I would attempt to converse with my Space Marine adversary about whether or not a unit on that Vantage could see that spot without an element of heavy terrain being involved. Of course, double checking to make sure that the Marine doesn't have a way to prevent obscuring either way. Now, for some, they may be looking at this thinking that the cone being drawn is passing through elements of the Vantage terrain and could interfere with that shot. It is clearly stated in the current rules that heavy terrain that intervenes in this back and forth transaction related to the Vantage terrain is completely ignored for the purpose of obscuring. This would mean that the Space Marine standing a bit back from the edge could still fire without being interfered with by the terrain it is using, but also vice versa to anyone who wishes to return fire. But now that Vantage Floor is clarified as light cover, models above gain a sort of permanent cover benefit to those below, rules pending from weapons and attacks. It would take another operative on what is considered equal or greater height to negate this form of light cover, and you probably wouldn't need the cone either. It could technically revert back to the triangle, a shift I enjoy from this new era. Again, the flashlight cone targeting line system can be a little primed for arguments. It is why it's good to get a finalized thought on the subject from both sides. A fun psychological trick would be to clarify how it would work before either player knows what side they have. That way the map rules are all pre-established before someone realizes that they would probably prefer to take advantage of that situation to the maximum potential that can be wrung from it. So take everything we've spoken about thus far and consider some examples. This bolter-wielding legionary that has no special cover or obscuring negating rules is seeking to attack some targets. It gazes across the kill zone floor at some Corsairs. It can certainly see one due to most of its model being just kind of there. There is a blade sticking out around a corner from another, which would by the rules allow it to be targeted. But there is a third target that you can't see here, and therefore that Corsair does not cross the visibility threshold. So at this point of the filter, only 2 Corsairs continue to the next round of valid target checking. The Corsair that is wholly in the vision without much issue for the Legionary is currently in conceal. And between the Legionary and itself, there is a piece of light terrain that does intersect with the targeting triangle and is within an inch of that Corsair. The Corsair's order is concealed, so targeting is prevented. That sword, however, is in the hands of a Corsair who, for one reason or another, is in engage. Even though the rest of the base and almost all the model can't be seen, this would still allow it to be a valid target for the most part. Valid target check confirmed. The action chosen requiring this would be the shoot action, so cover and obscuring checks must occur. The terrain it is behind is considered heavy, but that terrain is within an inch, so the only benefit it can receive is cover. All along the targeting lines, there is nothing else terrain-wise that will intersect that could provide obscuring as a benefit. Dice can be rolled, and that Corsair can choose to retain one save if it wishes. Now, in this instance, that same Legionary is on vantage. It can see 2 Corsairs from above, both clearly in vision, so that check is complete. One is hugging a big wall that has some outcroppings of terrain that before the round started was verified to be heavy and targeting line breaking. The other is in light cover. Both are in conceal. Even though the terrain protecting the Corsair hiding along the wall is so minor, it still breaks the targeting lines trying to find its base while sitting within a 1-inch sphere of the Space Elf. And since that terrain is considered heavy, this Corsair would not be a valid target, as Vantage only really affects light terrain when it comes to target validity. The other is only in light terrain, and Vantage does affect that when determining valid targets, so it could fire on that operative. When determining the boons the attack could receive in this situation, Vantage would provide nothing more than the ability to target the operative. The Corsair would have to be in an engage order to provide the accurate rules that Vantage can come with. This position does not completely wipe away the benefit that cover can provide, and even improves it in this situation for the Corsair, who can now retain 2 saves or a single critical save if it so chooses. As there is no heavy terrain with elements that break into this targeting cone, obscuring would not be provided. But think on this, if that situation were to exist here, not only would the Corsair still be able to retain 2 cover saves from its light cover, but the attacking Legionary would not be able to retain any critical and would have to sacrifice one of its normal hits. That's a lot of mitigation. And to be clear, there was a secret third Corsair in this example. Just below the wall the Legionary is on. As a line cannot be drawn from its head to any part on the Corsair's body, it wouldn't even be targetable in the first place, as it does not pass the first checkpoint on this journey to being a valid target. Now look, this is my second time around trying to explain vision and target validity in Kill Team 2024. I'm doing this because even after the much more condensed examples I had already given, I felt that it still just wasn't enough. Even this really only chips away at the stress and confusion I've seen others going through. Hopefully this serves to ease that, and be not afraid of your struggles with Kill Team. There are many seeking to play this odd little skirmish game we have all grown to love. A good percentage of those walked in not even knowing a thing about tabletop wargaming. Some have even walked out in much the same state. But maybe those of you who have stumbled into my little Space Hulk have found themselves revitalized in their quest to play a full and completely proper game of Kill Team. And with all this done and dusted, I turn it over to you out there. Did you find any of this helpful? Are there still holes in your understanding of whether or not something is targetable? Do you wish every kill zone was terrainless and you could just roll dice willy-nilly? Let us know in the comments below. Personally, I do feel like Kill Team gets a lot right, but there are certainly places for criticism of its tool sets. Coming from the last iteration, I am happy with many of the shifts involving Conceal and Vantage, as well as what Obscuring does. I know people don't really consider Obscuring to be as useful as it was, which is certainly true, but I also don't think people should undercut the value it brings to the table for both players. And if you have questions that you may want more immediate response to from a community that seems very interested in sorting out the Games Workshop gray in the writing, check that Discord link in the description below. We'll be happy to have you. Until next time, likes for the like god and subscribes for the subscribe throne. I am Kimrix, and I'll see you then.